Hello, and welcome to the panel on contesting concepts. My name is Sumi Madhok, and I'm Professor of Political Theory and Gender Studies here at the LSE, and I'm also a member of the organizing collective of the workshop. I'm delighted to chair this panel, not only because it's such a privilege to chair a panel when you admire all the papers so much, but also importantly, because these papers fill one with hope that this work is out there in the world. You all know the drill by now. After all, we're on the last panel before the round table of this workshop, but here we go. So 10 minutes per speaker, 35 minutes for questions, and the total time of the panel is 90 minutes. Accessibility has been a priority at all stages of the planning of this workshop. Live captions will be provided throughout, and speakers' texts will also be available on our website. Live interpretation to and from Spanish will be available throughout the 2 days, and you would have already noticed this as you've been sort of hearing and listening and participating in the workshop. The panel on contesting concepts, as this is what the panel is titled, gives us a very good insight into how to avoid some of the difficulties contained in producing critique upon critique of coloniality that is mired in the very logic of coloniality it seeks to critique. In other words, as I was saying earlier yesterday actually, and also said quite a number of times very powerfully by panelists this morning, so crucial that progressive critiques of the colonial logics that drive knowledge production do not reproduce the epistemic and geopolitical power of the Euro-Atlantic world all over again, or indeed reenact the epistemic absence and erasure of most of the world, or what Mehvish Ahmed this morning called in the last panel that just finished before this one, do not reproduce the hegemonic violence. And this hegemonic violence, of course, is mostly done by refusing epistemic relationality on the one hand, and by not having to engage at all with intellectual production that is done in most of the world on the other. And finally, it is vital, very vital indeed, that this work of critique centers the prevailing global political economies of knowledge production, including its own complicity in upholding and maintaining the inequalities of knowledge production around the globe. I'm conscious here that I'm using the phrase concept most of the world here. And while sort of thinking about most of the world, and in my writing I use most of the world, I was reminded by my brilliant colleague Aicha Chibukchu's question to the panelists on this second panel, which happened yesterday, about the phrase rest of the world and the forms of compromised work that it does. I agree with Aicha, and here I think that most of the world may possibly be a more useful phrase because it enables us to open the possibilities of thinking beyond the normative human, beyond the normative humanity, beyond the normative global north and south, beyond normative genders and sexualities, and towards different possibilities, envisionings and visualizings, and also of being in the world. And I'm inspired by the papers you will hear on this panel this afternoon, and of the generative and productive ways in which they locate conceptual production in the forms of ongoing epistemic violence, struggles against settler colonialism, and in the oppositional politics that seeks an alternative vision to the model of racial, colonial, capitalist global political economies. So let me, without further ado, introduce you to the speakers in the order in which they will speak. Sharmila Parmanand is an LSE Fellow in Gender and Human Rights at the LSE Department of Gender Studies. She has a PhD in multidisciplinary gender studies from the University of Cambridge, which she completed in 2020. Her research pursuits examine how interventions targeted at women reflect and shape their lived realities, with a focus on the politics of development and knowledge production and feminist entanglements with state on issues of migration, labor, and sexual violence. She also works on gender, masculinity, and populism. Her work, and a very interesting work, can I just reiterate that and re-emphasize that, has been published in the Anti-Trafficking Review, World Policy Journal, Oxford Political Review, and Feminist Review. She's also completing her book manuscript based on her research. Ana Virginia Moreira Gomes is a labor law professor at the Faculty of Law at Fortaleza University in Brazil. She coordinates the Center for Studies in Labor Law and Social Security at the University of Fortaleza. Her work focuses on international labor law, specifically on the following subjects: fundamental rights, International Labour Organization, international trade and labor, globalization, regulation of informal work, and protection of vulnerable workers. She's also a co-author of the book, Waste Pickers and Homeless People, Invisibility and Citizenship in the Streets of Fortaleza. Flávia Souza Maximo Pereira is Professor of Labor Law and Social Security Law at Universidade Federal de Ouro Preto, Brazil. She's also the coordinator of the research group Resaber Estudos em Saberes de Colonias at the Universidade Federal de Ouro Preto in Brazil. She is the author of Decolonial Thinking and Brazilian Labor Law, and with Pedro Augusto Gravata Nicoli of Labor Law and Dissident Epistemologies. She's also a member of the core group of the research network on democratizing work. Priya Raghavan is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, and she recently completed a PhD in gender studies at the London School of Economics. Her PhD research draws on post-colonial and decolonial feminist theory to interrogate dominant accounts of sexual violence in India. And her postdoctoral research examines how women's movements in Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Pakistan respond to and sustain gains in the face of backlash. With Billy Holzberg, she is the author of Securing the Nation Through the Politics of Sexual Violence, Tracing Resonances Between Delhi and Cologne, which was recently published in International Affairs. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, can I please recommend strongly that you do? And Priya is also currently completing a book manuscript based on her PhD thesis. And our last speaker, Niharika Pandit, is researching for her PhD on everyday politics of living under military occupation in the Kashmir Valley, also at the Department of Gender Studies, LSE. Her research focuses on spatial, temporal, and embodied experiences and their gendered underpinnings that constitute everyday living in militarized and occupied zones. She's a prolific writer and is an editorial collective member of the blog LSE Engenderings, and her writings have appeared in the Economic and Political Weekly, the Polis Project, Feminist Review blog, among others. And so I turn to the speakers now, and I can't wait to hear them. So Sharmila, on you go.
Thank you so much, Sumi. So I'll just go share my screen and start. Hang on, slideshow, tech, still hard. All right. I also want to acknowledge that today is International Sex Workers Day, so it's quite fitting. And I am thinking of my research partners in the Philippine Sex Workers Collective as I present this. All right, so I talk about an alternative reading of agency in sex work in the Philippines, where the dominant conception of it is that it is a form of victimhood from which women should be rescued. So there are multiple overlapping and confusing regulatory systems that govern the lives of sex workers in the Philippines. The revised penal code treats them as criminals. The anti-trafficking law and the Magna Carta for women assumes they are victims in need of rescuing. The labor code and the sanitation code tacitly implies that they exist and permits their employment in bars and massage parlors. So this confusion trickles down to local government policies, giving the police significant discretion over which sex workers to rescue or arrest, and increasing the precarity of sex workers. All throughout these conversations, sex workers were systematically excluded through a variety of discursive maneuvers, such as pathologizing discourses that construct them as too damaged or traumatized to be credible. My research project was a response to this epistemic injustice. I make several interventions in my research, two of which I'll discuss in this presentation. The first is a methodological disruption to how sex work has been studied in the Philippines. I did not want to reproduce the violent hierarchies of knowledge production in my encounters with sex workers, and wanted my research to serve as an assertive exercise that centers sex workers as political actors and authorities. I developed a collaborative research program with the Philippine Sex Workers Collective, a loose alliance of sex workers who advocate for the decriminalization of their work. My core research method was pakikipagkwentuhan, or roughly collective storytelling, over a period of 4 years with over 100 Filipino women street and establishment-based sex workers. Drawn from approaches in Filipino psychology, pakikipagkwentuhan involves informal, semi-structured, and unstructured conversations in natural settings. So mine were conducted in someone's home or parks and restaurants, often over shared meals. So in Filipino, we call these things salu-salo. The atmosphere is a bit more festive, and sometimes involving dancing and karaoke. Participants were welcome to ask each other questions and ask me questions, and to introduce conversation topics, photos, and other materials. This method involves pakikipagkapwa, for which there really is no clear translation into English. I mean, the closest I can find is intersubjectivity, or a sharing of the self and blurring of the boundaries between the self and the other. Perhaps another approximate concept would be Lugones's world travel. So it sees the research process not only as an academic exercise, but also as a source of validation and psychic relief for participants, and a space for recreation, in addition to other political possibilities generated by the knowledge produced. This was important because Filipino sex workers rarely had space to convene socially and deliberately reflect on their work or share their experiences, which makes it harder for them to define and shape society's understanding of their work. Many of those I met through my fieldwork 3 years ago have stayed friends, even if that was the first time they met, and some have become more politically active. Several described our pakikipagkwentuhan as like therapy. It would, and some of them would say things like, it was heartwarming to know that someone cared about their thoughts. The second intervention is a more direct reconceptualization of Filipino sex workers agency that challenges the dominant narrative within the Filipino women's rights establishment of sex work as universally victimizing, devoid of agency, and a form of male violence against women. This dominant understanding has entrenched a policy regime of rescue, rehabilitation, and ending demand. There is no direct equivalent term for sex work in Filipino. Neither is there one for trafficking and all of these other legal terms in which their experiences are forced to be made legible, through which their experiences are forced to conform, right? And so when I asked my research participants to describe what it is they did, the consistent answer was nagtatrabaho, which translates to working, or nagbebenta ng ligaya, which translates to selling joy. And so I explain why ultimately I chose to still use the word sex work, even if it's an imperfect representation in the PhD, which is written in English. Although as a result, I have made a commitment to also write a shorter version of my work in Filipino, so that the language captures more clearly what my participants were saying. I argue that our understanding of sex workers' agency needs to account for the regulatory context that increases their precarity and marginalization in the first place. Therefore, an emphasis on resistance or actions is a rigged and unproductive test of agency. So, drawing on Madhok's work on rethinking agency in oppressive contexts, I focus on sex workers' speech acts, for which pakikipagkwentuhan was a good fit. There is a mixture of choice and coercion in women's entry into and continued engagement in sex work, which renders the common freedom versus slavery binary used in anti trafficking deeply unhelpful and inaccurate. Many of my participants describe their engagement in sex work as discontinuous, which breaks depending on their life stages. Sex work was also one of the many income generating activities they engaged in, and they were puzzled that it was being singled out as uniquely problematic because it was one of many things that they did. They often used the Filipino word discarte. Again, there is no clear translation, but which roughly translates into resourcefulness, style, game, hustle, and is a term used to describe making do with what one has, usually in competitive or economic contexts. And it's a term that's used with pride, but also resignation. So they spoke with pride about contesting their displacement in the labor market. So things like, well, who are you going to exploit in factories now if we've chosen to do this instead? And resisting gendered, low-paid, and labor-intensive jobs such as sewing and domestic work. So when I spoke to them about rescue operations, they would say things like, "So my rescuer will do what? Hand me a broom and a toilet brush?" So unlike common understandings of false consciousness or even adaptive preferences, which permeate the way, the Western Academy would speak of sex work traditionally, which suggests that individuals in oppressive situations lack normative or strategic competence, my research participants were fully aware of the economic violence that influenced their employment options. Many of them indeed identified as victims. However, close attention to their rendering of the word victim reveals that they saw themselves as victims of poverty, stigma, and policies and practices that removed their control over their working conditions and exposed them to extortion and abuse. This is different to the conceptualization of victimhood put forward by the anti-trafficking and women's rights establishment in the Philippines and the anti-trafficking establishment globally, right? The different registers of victimhood matter because they engender different political demands and tell different stories about the relationships between sex workers in the state and the state. In one, the state is their rescuer, and in another, it is part of the problem. Finally, based on my research participants' reflections, I propose to read Sex Work and the Work of Overseas Filipino Domestic Workers Together, which is an act of epistemic disobedience because these conversations are kept separate in feminist theorizing and lobbying and in public discourse. The Filipino domestic worker is generally depicted as a bagong bayani, a modern hero and a self-sacrificing mother, as pure and as desexualized. A similar victim narrative underpins conversations on domestic work. I want that to be very clear. But the policy consensus is that domestic workers need access to political agency. Sex workers, on the other hand, are depicted as bad mothers, and those who do not and those of them who do not provide a credible performance of victimhood, who don't, identify with victimhood or share sad stories to describe their work, are seen as self-harming and morally irresponsible. So it's a disciplinary practice of getting them to assume the victim identity. I trouble this distinction by making visible sex workers' social, economic, and political contributions, much like domestic workers' remittances, and expose the normative femininity that partially drives the distinction between sex work and other forms of intimate labor. Domestic workers are still perceived as tied to the nuclear heterosexual family, and the kind of care that they perform is seen as acceptable, virtuous care, while sex workers are seen as a threat to the family. So in my work, I trouble those distinctions. And some quotes from sex workers, I think it's apt to end on these quotes. So they ask questions like, why do they view overseas Filipino workers as modern day heroes, but us as a social cancer? We are both trying to feed our kids. Why are our contributions invisible? They call us bad mothers because we are sex workers. But if our kids go hungry and we can't send them to school, we are also bad, right? We are the reason people are making money. Security guards, bar managers, hotel staff, and even the police. So I think these contributions that were completely invisible, even in feminist accounts of the economy, do need to be made visible. And that's another intervention that I introduce. All right, thank you very much. I'll end here.
Thank you very much, Sharmila. I mean, such a rich presentation, refusing to let any bit of it go in terms of holding together the conceptual, the methodological, the ethical, and the political, and sort of refusing to compromise on either one of them. So that's great. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to now invite Ana Gomes and Flávia Pereira to start with their presentation. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Boa tarde a todas e todos. Good afternoon. I'm Flávia Massimo. I'm a professor at Universidade Federal de Ouro Preto. And this is Ana. She's sharing the screen. Ana. Okay. Ana is a professor at Federal University of Fortaleza, and today we'd like to thank you, all the organizers, for this disruptive academic event. It's amazing. And our presentation is about the Working Manifesto and how its principles could be translated into Brazilian reality. So working humans are so much more than resources. The opening sentence of the Working Manifesto is not new, but still sounds powerful, which means that the worker's body is not like any pound of flesh sold on the market, because it's also made up of spirit, affection, hope, and voice. But can the privileged listen? In 2020, the Working Manifesto was published in more than 40 newspapers from 30 countries, signed by 6,000 researchers. It was written by Isabelle Ferreiras, Julie Batilana, and Dominique Médan, who crafted a key message for the world of work during the pandemic. It's necessary to democratize firms, involve employees in the decisions in the workplace, to decommodify work, guaranteeing protect employment for all, and to remediate the environment, centralizing the environmental value in our economy. But all these three principles were focused on the employment relationship. The Brazilian book, Manifesto do Trabalho, unfolds these principles using a decolonial feminist perspective by questioning the epistemic basis of labor law in the global South. So we have in mind here that decolonizing is not diversifying, but what is the limit of strategic essentialism in labor law? Although the employment relationship presents itself as an instrument of universal protection, it is also structured by a heterosexual, non-white, and anti-feminine foundation, maintaining the gender coloniality in labor relations. This decolonial feminist critique is not about silencing the employment relationship or the Working Manifesto. When we criticize labor law here, we're also defending it, because the simple employment destruction as being happening right now with neoliberalism is nothing more than deepening coloniality for Black, Indigenous, female, and LGBT workers. These are the voices that are silenced first, because our voices do not sound the same. But it's also necessary to go beyond. Brazilian labor law reproduced the Eurocentric narrative in a historical sequence of slavery, servitude, and free labor to exalt the employment relationship as the greatest achievement of freedom in modernity. However, in Latin America colonization, the forms of work did not emerge from this historical sequence. Slavery, servitude, and free labor were exercised simultaneously in a capitalist world system, and they were associated with the idea of race linked to the color of the skin, and with gender to naturalize inferior functions in the social division of labor, to sell flesh of dominated people, to establish who had a human voice, because our voices do not sound the same. Indigenous were confined to servitude, Blacks were slaves, European white women were limited to reproductive work, Black and Indigenous women were raped and exploited in domestic enslavement, Black women died working mining slavery. Only white European men could perform free work. This means that in the colonization of Latin America, there was an exclusive association of male whiteness with free work, with wages, with the standards of human voice, and this still persists. We must listen. There is a legal coloniality in the employment relationship. We, from the South, reproduce the Eurocentric liberal law theory created by and for the white male worker. This legal narrative legitimized the sexual and racial division of labor in Brazil through labor law itself. This is why guaranteeing protect employment for all, as the decommodified principle demands, is insufficient for a detachment from the condition of subalternity. It's a complex issue involving the pluralization of the epistemic subject in labor law. It's about geopolitics and body politics of knowledge. Is about silent ontological labor. And this cannot be reduced to the binary narrative of formal and informal work, because our voices do not sound the same. An example of this is Law 150 in Brazil, which recognizes all employment rights for domestic workers. It's an immense achievement carried out by the domestic workers themselves, silencing the union system. But even with their employment recognized, poverty, informality, and discrimination against such bodies considered non-human remains. They are subaltern flesh, because our voices do not sound the same. Anna?
So sorry, I was trying to unmute myself and present the PowerPoint, but now I'm ready. So this also stands for the democratized principle. Democratization cannot exclude workers in informal, autonomous, and precarious relationship, the dominant form of work in the Global South. The right to have their voice echoed, the power to organize collectively, to participate effectively in dialogue over decisions that affect them, constitute a basic dimension for the implementation of other rights. Labor law, however, still offers little of its institutional tools, freedom of association and collective bargaining rights, for example, for informal and self-employed workers. Let me take again the example of domestic workers, one of the most affected during the pandemic. In Brazil, 1.6 million domestic workers lost their occupation. 400,000 were formal workers, 1.2 informal workers. They don't have institutionalized channels to discuss policies to protect their occupation and to reduce informality. Currently, 75% of them are in the informal market. Domestic workers' union that exist in the country since the 1930s function despite labor law that doesn't promote this type of organization. The democratization of work restricted to formal work or to the new informal brought by technological change that is common in the North ignores the democratic deficit left by the majority of workers, old informal workers. This is so characteristic of the Brazilian reality as it reflects, as Flávia said, our colonial and slave-based origins and mentals its structure. Finally, the remediate principle. It must correspond to the same rationality relating to informal workers, including occupations that do not follow the logic of industrial wage labor, as for example, subsistence agriculture. It is ironic that types of work that contribute to the preservation of the planet and relates to nature are carried out through informal and precarious work in dangerous and unhealthy conditions. One important example is the work of waste pickers who carry out their activity of collecting, sorting, treating waste, and making it possible to be reused and recycled. But they work in aberrant conditions. Waste pickers can be considered as essential workers, especially in countries without a formal waste management system, as Brazil, and in a world trying to save the planet. This work, usually carried out autonomously, is ignored by labor law, which by privileging the formal employee offers not even basic protections to these workers. Waste pickers have organized in Brazil. They have created a national movement in 2001, and during the pandemic, they have been able to negotiate with different provinces to suspend their activities and to receive a minimal income. All this despite the law that doesn't even recognize them as workers. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna and Flávia. I mean, this is the thinking of that really careful thinking about the colonial subject of law, right? So who's the subject of law, of labor, but not leaving it at that, going on to think about an alternative vision of what might be the sort of, democratic subject of law, who would then speak in a way that might be heard. Thank you so much for that. Let's go to Priya Raghavan. Yes, please, Priya. 10 minutes are all yours.
Thank you, Sumi. And thanks also to all the organizers and speakers and attendees for creating this really exceptional space. It's an absolute privilege to speak here. My talk today draws on my doctoral research, which sought to take seriously post-colonial, anti-racist, and queer feminist cautions against the regulatory and coercive effects of dominant efforts to address sexual violence. These scholars have pointed to how the expansion of the carceral and muscular apparatus of the state, the licensing of capitalist rescue narratives, the consolidation of violent ethno-nationalisms, colonialisms, and militarized border regimes, and the increased surveillance and control of gendered and racialized bodies are but a few of the dividends of an increasingly fraught war against sexual violence. I argue that much of the violence enacted in the name of protecting women is enabled by a particular mischaracterization of and resultant misorientation towards the subject of sexual violence. Specifically, the representation of the subject is subtended by a politically dangerous and conceptually untenable victim-agent binary. Mediated by rationalities of caste, race, class, and religion, women are imagined as either vulnerable victims in need of protection or as capable and even culpable agents, but never simultaneously both. The failure to reconcile victimhood and agency within dominant discourses of sexual violence is then precisely the condition of possibility for a range of violent and regulatory outcomes. The figure of the agentless victim occasions a paternalistic, protectionist, and inevitably patriarchal politics of response to sexual violence. Through the institution of what Ratna Kapoor calls sexual security regimes, or practices of what Srila Roy terms punitive paternalism, the state steps in as protective patriarch, firm but well-intentioned in its will to empower through the imposition of curfews in women's hostels, the celebration of the patriarchal family unit and its regulatory controls over gendered bodies, the expansion of the patriarchal state and its muscular machinery, all in the name of the victim and her vulnerability. The victim-agent binary also becomes grounds for the denial of victimhood to non-conforming subjects read as agentable, where agency is reinterpreted as culpability and any evidence of volition voids vulnerability. There is then an urgent need to challenge this dominant victim-agent binary or this binary representational regime and to assemble the archival and conceptual material with which to reconcile victimhood and agency in discourses of sexual violence. In response to this imperative, I draw on my supervisor Sumi Madhok's methodological contribution of feminist historical ontology. Feminist historical ontologies not only interrogate concepts and their histories and the work they do in specific locations, but they equally point to the possibility of different conceptual arrangements. Drawing on the work of the Subaltern Studies Collective together with Sumi Madhok's feminist historical ontologies, I assembled an archive from which a different non-binary imagination of victimhood and agency might emerge. Comprised of letters, petitions, pamphlets, interviews, rural newsletters, slogans, chants, and other ephemera, this archive contains forms of knowledge traditionally understood as what Partha Chatterjee has called the non-canonical, unsophisticated, down market. These unqualified and disqualified knowledges form what I call the subaltern archive. And I named it as such, both in acknowledgement of my debt to subaltern studies, but also in recognition of the archive's own precarious status as banished, fragmented, and fugitive, unable to register to the hegemonic ear. Through the subaltern archive, subjects appear not simply as embodiments of both victimhood and agency, but as subjects whose agentival manifestations often derive precisely from their experiences of victimhood. These archives hold representations of personal and collective testimonial practice, tell stories of re-scripting dominant social and institutional narratives, reveal occasions of collective deliberation, moments of new solidarities, and the forging of new political communities, all decidedly agentival practices emerging precisely from subaltern women's encounter with sexual violence and their struggles against it. Such a conception of agency is necessarily resistant to voluntarist accounts of liberal autonomy. Agency, as I read it in the Subaltern Archive, materializes in response to, rather than in the place of, conditions of victimhood. Conceptualizations of victimhood in the Subaltern Archive also pose a fundamental challenge to dominant protocols of victim recognition. Refusing scripts of passivity, helplessness, and fragility, subaltern subjects contest ontological accounts of victimhood as an essential feminized characteristic. Victimhood is understood as an event, a stage rather than a state, a temporally circumscribed experience of harm rather than a defining, permanently incapacitating condition. Accounts of victimhood in the Subaltern Archive are insistently structural and intersectional, viewing victimhood as politically and socially induced rather than inscribed onto or an inevitable result of women's fragile bodies. Victimhood is thus framed as the shared proximity to, experience, and knowledge of gendered, classed, colonial, and caste-determined histories and continuities, rather than a stable identity category rooted in biology. As represented in the Subaltern Archive, the victim is one who reacts rather than one who passively invites assistance. The shared knowledge of victimhood is then both the basis for the forging of a collective subaltern community, as well as the substrate from which this collective polity derives its capacity for a radical agency. As Tenmaji Soundarajan describes, Dalit experiences of victimhood are almost inevitably followed by the assertion of survivorship and political identity. To Soundarajan, the political imagination of a Dalit woman is necessarily steeped in a simultaneous recognition of victimhood and agency. And I quote, "The very idea of the Dalit woman is that we've been broken, but we are surviving and fighting to thrive." Kashmiri feminist collective Zanan Vanan similarly assert, and I quote, "We are being projected as docile, innocent, naive women who are beautiful, but scarred by the tragedy inflicted upon us by militants and armed groups from across the line of control. This narrative is propagated to legitimize the presence of the Indian army in the region to safeguard these Kashmir ki kalis, or flowers of Kashmir. We refuse the Indian media's portrayal of us as crying mothers, sisters, and daughters. We mourn, and yet we rise to pelt stones and write songs." Rallies organized by predominantly Dalit women development workers in the wake of the rape of Bhavari Devi in 1992 resounded with chants of "Hum Bharat ki nari hai, phool nahi chingari hai." We are India's women, not delicate flowers, but powerful sparks. Nestled in the Subaltern Archive are thus crucial glimpses into other conceptual possibilities for victimhood and agency. A subject of sexual violence who is understood as simultaneously embodying victimhood and agency demands a radically distinct set of responses and relationships to those engendered by the binary representational regime. The Subaltern Archive shelters the seeds of a decidedly anti-carceral politics of response to sexual violence, seeking answerability rather than protection, refusing a relationship of dependency, and interrogating the moral authority of the state and its instruments. Representations of the subaltern subject of sexual violence as a subject failed by the state rather than an object for protection hold the potential to disrupt logics of carcerality, coloniality, occupation, surveillance, and control authorized by the figure of the agentless victim. The unremittingly structural intersectional account of victimhood presented by the Subaltern Archive also gives the lie to liberal and neoliberal mythologies of the unfettered autonomous subject responsible for her own suffering and culpable in her own injury. The Subaltern Archive challenges the notion of the individual as the primary locus of agency and responsibility through illustrations of collective subjectivity emerging from experiences of violation. Crucially, these solidarities refuse or transcend dominant communities through which safety and security are traditionally imagined: the patriarchal family, the caste or ethno-religious community, or the colonial nation. They work instead to actively destabilize their legitimacy and the fantasy of their sanctuary. In sum, the subaltern archive demonstrates the futility and risk of any gesture towards justice for the subaltern subject of sexual violence that does not insist on revealing and resisting the constitutive violences of caste and class hierarchies, exclusionary ethno-nationalisms, liberal and neoliberal ideologies, and the coloniality of the nation state. The subaltern archive is then a crucial site from which to uncover banished, displaced histories of critique and struggle, and from which to reimagine victimhood and agency away from their binary orthodoxy. Assembling such archives and insisting on their epistemic value is thus an indispensable practice in the far from concluded project of resisting the binaries that violently circumscribe subaltern possibilities of being and knowing in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priya. Another very rich paper talking about conceptual possibilities. And I think that seems to be a kind of a link coming across thus far, right? Waiting for Niharika to come through, but thus far, sort of, thinking about conceptual possibilities, seeking different sites, whether it's in different forms of labor and categories of workers and so on, and work, or whether it's in the form of sort of collective storytelling in the case of Sharmila or in your subaltern archives. But I think what is absolutely sort of coming strongly as a narrative here is that the methodological, the epistemological, and the conceptual are interlinked, and that they all are sort of speaking to each other all of the time, and that to miss out on any one of those links is produces a huge amount of epistemic harm. Okay, so Niharika, 10 minutes, over to you.
Thank you, Sumi and LSE Gender for organizing this wonderful workshop. I will be talking about Zulm, Halat, and everyday politics of living under military occupation. So Zulm and Halat, insufficiently translated as oppression and the condition or situation, emerged in various textures and spaces in Kashmir, in interviews, during routine conversations, over tea and food, when walking around Srinagar or driving to border towns. While emerging critical and feminist scholarship has begun to locate the heuristic potential of Zulm and Halat in thinking through the arbitrary nature of violence, it does not yet attend to the theoretical trajectories these concepts unfold beyond being a shorthand for life under occupation. In my intervention, I insist that we examine why and under what circumstances do Kashmiris living under occupation deploy Zulm and Halat to make sense of their political realities. What specific ways of thinking and living do these concepts unravel? I suggest that the situated nature of Zulm and Halat in local Urdu and kosher vocabularies is conceptually pertinent precisely as it insists on the protracted, ongoing, and contested nature of occupation. While Zulm unsettles thinking of oppression beyond violent events or its episodes in a linear sense, Halat insists on temporal continuity. In this way, normalcy, a descriptor used by the Indian state, is not disrupted by Kashmiri insurgents and protesters. Rather, Zulm abounds, and Halat have been uncertain for long, to which resistance becomes an anti-colonial response. I read these concepts as distinct epistemic orientations that go beyond the binary of exceptions rule, before, after, unrest, normalcy, to frame military occupation not as an aberration or a punctuated presence, but one that is shaped by permanent uncertainty. This or disorientation allows thinking of Kashmir beyond hegemonic nation-state times and the region as continually occupied and oppressed in contemporary times by the Indian state and its military occupation, altogether deeply indicative of its coloniality. Together, these concepts visualize everyday complexities of occupation, especially its temporality, that along with being nonlinear, remains muddled in the sense that it simultaneously inhabits temporal experiences of the past with a desire for an azad, free future. Often when Ruxana and Zara spoke about halat, their understanding was rooted in an Islamic sense of time, as well as their spiritual relation to God. Accordingly, they believed in time as a continuous entity that remains beyond mortal control. These spiritual beliefs allowed them to zoom out of their specific experiences of occupation and look at the bigger picture of life and its transience. After narrating stories of death and despair, they would often say, and I quote here, "Nothing's forever. Life and death are all written by God. Army and police are just mediums. They don't decide life and death. God does." These moments made me curious, but also irked me as to why, after detailing at length how occupational forces have claimed thousands of Kashmiri lives, would they insist on these forces as simply a medium? Did it not, even if slightly, evacuate the state of its responsibility? I stay with this question, but also go beyond the liberal fatalizing narratives that are ordinarily attached to causal beliefs on God to unpack what these articulations do by those under occupation in the specific spaces and times in which they emerge. Importantly, in remembering and articulating Kashmir differently, they allow people to survive an occupation that thrives on deepened violence and uncertainty. In the hours that Ruxana and I spent talking, she spoke about how her belief in God has sustained her in trying times. While sharing her experience of growing up in a village that was the center of militant resistance, she would add that perhaps Kashmiris must have done something in their past lives that so much violence is inflicted on them. Rather than foreclosing responsibility or muting the violence of occupation, this framing allows a distinct epistemic sense of the situation. By this logic, Ruxana evacuated the Indian state as well as the figure of the Indian soldier of their overbearing power and presence, instead framing them as a mere medium in the function of power. In this act of decentering lies Ruxana's refusal to normalize occupation or states' claims of Kashmir's full integration into India as only a matter of time. I don't read this as a moment of absolving the state, but decentering its sovereignty claims while recentering their experiences as Kashmiris, a people who've lived through many oppressive regimes. This framing also enabled making sense of absurd violence and persistent uncertainty that they continue to live with. In absence of any justificatory logic of violence and oppression, looking at one's experience from the lens of collective struggle that Kashmiris as a people go through offers some sense of control and respite in grieving through loss. Ruxana's claim also unsettles any neat division between occupier and occupied, wherein many native Kashmiris with class and political privileges are cogs in the wheel of occupational machinery, who've time and again diluted their cause for self-determination. In a Fanonian sense, while acknowledging it as the nature of occupation that creates a coterie of native governing elite who are similar in form, function, and motive to the occupying state, her claim engenders critical reflexivity. This explains the disillusionment that many others shared with me about so-called democratic processes instituted by the Indian state, including holding of assembly elections. Thinking in this way enables both a critique and suspicion of state-backed political processes, opening up potential for different future imaginaries that go beyond the nation state. This also allowed many women to reflect on their own position in Kashmir's political struggle, especially for young Zara, whose hopes for Kashmir were feminist in the sense that she continually calls out and in situated ways resists patriarchal ascription of gender roles that ultimately marginalize women. She refused to untether her political hopes for free Kashmir from defying marginalization of Kashmiri women, which she understood as simultaneous for any true sense of azadi to exist. Finally, Zara and Ruxana, two women separated by age, class, caste, and location, articulated that the nature of time is such that zulm will end one day, yet it is wrong to not resist and silently endure it all. Both insisted that over time, all systems of oppression are bound to end. They attributed this to the very nature of oppression and being as they understand it. Yet to not resist an oppressor and quietly suffer qualifies as a sin for them in the test of time. In this way, resisting oppression becomes an ontological duty for them as Kashmiri Muslim women. Time in this sense emerges not simply as a phenomenon that goes on, but one that is witnessed and to which they remain accountable. This conception of time is a complex one. While life and living are ephemeral, their service and relation to God is tested by time. Time thus becomes a spiritual conduit to God that is both a witness to their tribulations as well as their ability to resist. Rather than being invoked to simply justify a fatalistic sense of life or to deny a colonial occupation, this sense of time, the specific conditions and context in which it's evoked, aids making sense of and surviving forms of militarized state control. This sense of time as halat and as witness, in which zulm gets accounted, it is both an ontological and an epistemic one. It gives meaning to how many Kashmiris living under occupation make sense of their being and duties, to which resisting political oppression takes center stage. It also insists on continuous nature of time and temporality, challenging state narratives of historical and political time. So my intention in this brief provocation has been to insist on attending to grounded concepts following Sumi Madhok, whose excellent paper I always sort of reference here, that go beyond understanding time as non-linear under occupation and militarism to trace its implications, the conceptual pathways of everyday living and power, they unfold without subsuming it simply as empirical difference. The what after critique, so to say, right? So it remains necessary to trace these activations and unfoldings in relation to what they say about power itself. And in this case, the power of military occupation as well as coloniality. Indeed, this suggests that militarism that underlies and shapes the logic and processes of occupation cannot be untethered from coloniality. Overall, thinking of time as witness is imbued with critical potential precisely as it enables those under occupation to make sense of their conditions and how they are shaped differentially by intersecting in colonial relations of power. Most importantly, it enables imagining how other worlds are possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niharika. Again, super rich paper. I think I'm going to have to take a few weeks off to kind of try and think through all the wonderful things that everyone has been saying, because, you know, this takes time to process so much fabulous stuff going on. You know, temporality, time, location, subjectivity, oppression, all super important things that you've kind of drawn our attention to in the 10 minutes that you've had. But I think two things stood out for me, actually right across the papers. Two things stood out for me. One was the question of epistemic presence, you know, and the importance of epistemic presence and what the absence and the erasure and the silencing does, right, in the particular context. And so the context you're all describing are different contexts of coloniality, and that's because, of course, you know, you are very careful scholars taking into account questions of location and so on very seriously. And the second one, of course, was about what you were saying, grounding context in political struggles, and actually that's something that's come across throughout all the papers as well. And then the question that then comes up is, what about the intellectual resources that are required for the grounding of different concepts, right? What intellectual resources are people drawing on? And of course, it's very clear in you know, in what Niharika was saying, in the context of Kashmir, that the you know, the state, that statism dominates so much of how thinking and acting and so on is done. And so the state becomes, or indeed concepts grounded within statist discourses are absolutely to be disavowed and refused. And that becomes one of the sort of groundswell of intellect, you know, becomes part of that intellectual resource. So that was super interesting in the ways in which you were sort of saying, yes, I'm calling it the broad Islamic tradition, but actually there are various different ways in which, you know, interesting ways in which these women are engaging, even though they're drawing upon it. Okay, so let's, with all of those things in mind, let's see what we've got. We've got some specific questions coming through, which you would have already seen. But I wondered, before I go into the specific questions, because I think there are some things that can be drawn from the questions that have been asked, if I could ask all the panelists about their work with reconceptualizing, not just reconceptualizing, some reconceptualizing, yes, of course, but also working with that question of epistemic presence. So working with new concepts which bring into presence different groups of people, right, who are otherwise not heard, not seen, as you were saying, Flavia and Anna, they do not sound like us, right? So which is always that question of erasure, who's being excluded, who's being erased. And I wondered if what were the kinds of methodological sort of concerns around translation, around inclusion, around conceptual diversity, and so on, when you've been embarking on the research that you've been doing. So the nuts and bolts really here. So I wondered if we could start with Priya. Priya, did you want to start? Or we could start with Anna and Flavia, whoever feels able to. Sharmila, I leave it to either of you to kick it off.
I can give it a go.
Go for it.
So I think that part of the work, and this was a particularly challenging methodological question for me for my thesis, because I didn't really start with this assembling of a subaltern archive. In fact, where my project started was with trying to look at the ways in which the subaltern subject of sexual violence is accommodated within the dominant register. In what sort of metaphors and figures is the subaltern subject of sexual violence allowed to appear, whether it is in case law or dominant feminist discourses. And it seemed like there were only very particular idioms within which the subject was accommodated, either as this sort of icon of abjection, and especially when it was the Dalit subaltern subject as this sort of permanent victim frozen into this position of abjection. Or in the case of Bhavari Devi, where we saw a lot of the developmentalist discourse sort of projecting her as this agent of change, and that is literally the term in which she appeared even in the legal petition to in sort of depositions or in the public interest litigation that spurred on a big legislative reform around sexual harassment in India. So it seemed that a part of the job is, I suppose, to first track the ways in which these sort of subjects that come from this place of radical unrepresentability, I suppose as Spivak would define subalternity. I suppose part of the challenge is to first track the terms in which they are accommodated within the dominant archive. And then to look at what are the sort of protocols of, for example, victim recognition that circumscribe how subjects are allowed to appear, where they're allowed to appear, and when they are recognized. And I suppose then that work inevitably led me to searching for alternative archival material from which they were allowed to appear in less violently circumscribed ways. And so I must admit that, as you well know, Sumi, my sort of thesis methodology did not appear at the very beginning of my 4 years, where I knew this is exactly what I'm going to be looking for and how I'm going to look for it. And so I think that again, particularly my exposure to this question of feminist historical ontologies, which begins with this somewhat genealogical exercise of looking at concepts, where they travel, what work they do in different locations, but then also pushes us to look for alternative sites in which they can appear in different ways. And then again, the work of the Subaltern Studies Collective was really crucial in pointing to where these sites might be. And so a lot of the work, and I think Clara's question, which hopefully I can come to later on what constitutes various archive.
I could. Yeah. So what I was trying to do was compare the dominant representations of sex workers in anti-trafficking and their lived realities. Now, these are not separate things, right? It's not like you have discourse on one side and then sex workers not affected by discourse on the other side. So the same people that I was trying to learn from are also produced by the same discourse that I'm trying to critique. And so for me, the biggest challenge was being mindful of that throughout the research process, right? While at the same time signaling my solidarity and conscious partiality to this community, because they can't just be research subjects after all the violence that they've endured already. So that difficult balancing act. And so mindful that I am working with a stigmatized community that is also produced by the context that I'm critiquing. And there were many like experiences. So my initial encounter with them, everything I will hear is sob stories, like very sad stories, like, oh, I did not really want to do this, but then I'm forced. And then eventually there's a lot more trust building because it's like a 4-year officially fieldwork thing, but it obviously lasted longer than that. The relationship predated my PhD. And then eventually the conversations would evolve. And I would hear stories of how, oh no, this was also rewarding and fun. And sometimes I do this for myself too. And it's not just all sob stories, right? So at first, and so that kind of depth and that kind of complexity. And I would hear a lot about how sex work was essential to them demonstrating virtuous mothers. And one reading of that is you are reworking social scripts, right? You are claiming this and taking pride in this. But at the same time, that is a reaction too, right? And you could also argue that in some ways, this is a reaction to being stigmatized. So there are all these like difficult ways of reading what's going on. And eventually what I made peace with, and Sumi's work was really helpful here, was to just recognize, look, there's no inner truth I'm going to uncover from these interviews or from this ethnographic work. There's none of that. We're dealing with multiple subjectivities. We're dealing with people who inhabit different worlds and position themselves quite differently depending on what world, and to just respect and capture that complexity and recognize the limitations and the mediations in how they self-present to me, and just acknowledge that, and then recognize that my work is not going to be the decisive work that settles this conversation. It's just exploratory. It's just beginning the conversation. Someone else might do something else, do a similar thing and find out slightly different, and have slightly different reflections, and that's okay. And just making peace with that discomfort and that ambivalence.
Yeah. Thank you. Flávia, Anna.
Okay, so in the case of waste pickers, even though it's a very, very visible activity, everybody can see them on the streets carrying a cart full with like sometimes more than 100 kilos of residues. There is a resistance in even consider that activity work. It is seen as some irregular activity. And I have done empirical work with waste pickers, interviews and observations. And in 100% of the answers I have, they see their activity as value work. They consider that work that is dignified, even though the conditions they work. So there is, I think, a discompass between law and the reality of especially very poor and informal workers that we totally need to change, expand these boundaries of labor law. So Flávia?
So I think the question that Sumi made is amazing because Anna is saying that there is a dissonance between labor law and the working class because it's about intellectual resources. Intellectuals in Brazil are shaped by and for coloniality of knowledge. So the dissonance between labor law and the reality of the working class is not random. It's a political project. So how can we change this? So I was discussing with Anna 2 days ago, and we're thinking about 2 ways of solutions: short-term solutions or urgent solutions for this working class, and long-term solutions. So short-term solutions, of course, they pass through basic income policies or tax wealthy policies, but this doesn't change the juridical category of work, of labor, of time, of who is the epistemic subject of labor law. So we have another dimension of long-term solutions. So we have to think in the intern dimension of coloniality of gender in labor law, and the external dimension. The internal dimension is in the employment relationship. So how to contest the category of time, for example. Time in care work is not the same concept of time in a employment relationship, because it has different dimensions, subject dimensions that are not, it's not possible to measure with the juridical institution that was made by the industrial relations. So in the employment relationship. So we have to think about how to contest this contest inside the employment relationship, and also outside, how to design social protections in labor law for informality, not for informal workers. But beside this, we have to rethink about how we produce knowledge, right? So we also think about knowledge praxis. I work in a university, Universidade Federal de Ouro Preto, which means black gold, because it's because of slavery in Brazil. And now we have a PhD program that we have a method that we're creating, constructing a method with the community that we call knowledge practice. There is a kind of hybrid participatory observance and also cartographic method. We are working with architectures, people from education, people from law. So we are constructing this knowledge with the subject. So Priya was saying that subjects of sexual violence, we created in our university a legal norm for the female students who were violated by professors. Was the first norm in like this in our university in Brazil. And we're also constructing with the people who are affected by the dam collapse in Brazil. I don't know if you heard about the dam collapse in Brazil, Mariana, Brumadinho. We are constructing with them social technologies to reshape the frame of law. So these are the methods that we're working right now. Our PhD program is the name is New Subjects, New Rights. So we're trying to abolish these categories. We don't have divisions in labor law, tax law, civil law. We are like in an interdisciplinary program in this method. So it's pretty much what we're doing here.
Thank you. Yes, please, Niharika.
To just respond briefly to what you asked, Sumi, and also after listening to all the panelists, I think in the context of my work, the methodological imperative has not simply been of a kind of archival recovery, but also tracking the absences. So political worlds and sort of located ways of knowledge making have always been present, right? But it's also tracking the ways in which they've been made illegible in both the state narratives, but also in dominant, in the subcontinental context, Savarna epistemologies that don't make certain worldviews or ways of life thinkable. And I think then again, for example, an example that comes to my mind is why our slogans of Azadi within the Indian nation state context are so legible and understandable when vis-a-vis when Kashmiri activists make them, right? And it is precisely because they contest the idea of a coherent nation state, and they sort of, contest that sovereignty claim. So I think it also requires tracing these contestations, but in many ways also tracking the situated ephemeral ways in which people are challenging these claims, and especially with sort of a lot of interlocutors that I was speaking with. It's also social medias and different everyday articulations in which they challenge precisely the claims that the state makes. So I think it's important to really offer sort of legibility to that kind of knowledge making, which is so dominant in everyday life as they're living it. So I think that would be, sorry.
Thank you, Niharika. Okay, so we've got some very specific questions coming in, but I think that they can actually go across. There is a question from Clara Schwartz, who says, actually it was directed to Priya, but I think that goes right across, primarily because all of you are working with in subjects in very precarious locations, whether through state violence or through marginalities of various kinds, through erasure and so on. So Clara's question is that, as I said, it was directed to Priya, but I think this goes right across, which is asking about the precarity of subaltern conceptual archives themselves, right? So I suppose what is at the, in some ways, I think it gets to a number of things. One of them is, of course, how not to romanticize the subaltern subject, how not to romanticize the archive, how not to romanticize the, so on and so forth, without letting go of of holding power to account. Yes, so I think it's that kind of holding together by and Sharmila, in some ways you were talking about that process, right? Okay, so I'm not looking for truth here, these are not truth claims and so on, but without letting go of the Filipino state, right, to account. So not sort of falling into that trap whereby they are the unbelievable subjects, right? So I suppose it's that kind of difficulty around the precarious or the precarity of the subaltern conceptual archives or the subaltern intellectual resources or political projects, whether they might be waste pickers or they might be, or they might be the subaltern subjects, that Sharmila and Priya are talking about. Niharika's subjects are somewhat different because they are, that is a settler colonial context, which has a very different kind of precarity attached to it. But I wondered if, I'll give you a chance to come back on this, because this is quite a big question, and I'd love to hear all the panelists on this. But I wondered if I could go to some of the very specific questions which you could respond much more quickly, directed to the panelists, because it's also important to hear the questions, as always. And there is a question from Christina Nollard to Sharmila. It's a very direct question. I'm interested in the untranslatable word that Sharmila has used towards the beginning of her presentation. Although she has given an approximate translation into English, could she please elaborate a bit more, maybe giving some examples of sentences or situations in which it's commonly used? And there is another question for Sharmila, but it's also a question that can go across to Anna and Flavia, which is on the matter of social reproduction. And this is a question from Asia, who sort of says, I have a question which I deal with in my own work regarding the framework of social reproduction, or the framework of social reproduction. You talked about how sex workers saw their work as just one of the many precarious strategies for sustaining livelihoods. Do you see this understanding of wage earning work as a way to ensure reproduction of life as gendered? Are there concepts other than social reproduction that you can draw upon to understand this continuum of labor? So it is a question to you, but I wondered if Anna and Flavia also have a response to, whether social reproduction theory as a conceptual framework, has particular elasticity going across the global south and global north, because sometimes it's often said it doesn't quite go across to the global south that much. And then there's a question from Marsha. It is particularly to Sharmila, and she says, I like how you put into dialogue the accounts of domestic workers globally with sex workers domestically. I wonder if there are other dialogues that influence your work, but they are no more free from potential co-optation by anti-trafficking advocates, i.e. Pratt's work on murdered sex workers and Filipino domestic workers in Vancouver. Just a thought rather than a perfectly formed question. So I think since we have 10 minutes, I think Sharmila, if you could just take those very specifically directed questions to you and maybe take 2 minutes and 25 seconds Would you think that's all right? Yeah. Okay, cool. And then Anna and Flavia, if you wanted to come into the question of social reproduction very quickly, that's fine too. And then we will open up the floor to the precarity of of the conceptual archive and thinking about conceptual possibilities in relation to subalternity. Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Great.
So the word that I used was pakikipagkapwa, and the rough translation was intersubjectivity. So I'll just give you the etymology of the word. So it comes
and we
from
can also put it in chat later. Sorry, just
yeah.
to say, we could also put it in chat. Yeah.
So the base word is kapwa, right? No clear translation. The prefix ka is meant to denote a union. So think co-worker, or like co-house or whatever. Like so ka, right? But and from the other word puang, which means space. So it kind of gestures towards a space that we share with others, a psychic and a physical space. Now the way the word co is used in English is usually, I mean, it denotes a fellowship, but in a way that makes clear that there's a self and an other, right? You go co-worker. Whereas in kapwa, there isn't quite that distinction. So it's not exactly neighbor or fellow being. It's almost like you're part of the same whole. So that's the closest I can get to describing it. In terms of whether this conception of social reproduction, wage earners, whether it's gendered, I mean, I argue in my work it is, because the makeshift economy, which again is the closest approximation I can get to Descartes, right? The makeshift economy, the informal economy is quite gendered. You have more women in it empirically, partly a result of the need for more flexibility, although that is changing now with a lot of global restructuring processes and work becoming, less full-time and more precarious and more insecure. So in the context of the Philippines, definitely still is gendered. And so flexible working hours. Second, less access to workers' protection, ability to unionize and things like that. And third, a lot of the labor involved is intimate forms of labor. So domestic work, sex work, which are in some ways kind of gendered as they are practiced work at the moment. So yeah, I do think there's an element of genderedness here, but at the same time, I do question whether feminists who take a very strong victimization position are reinscribing that genderedness by saying your body is the house of your essential self, and the moment you engage in sexual services, you are like suffering a loss of an essential self. So there is a reinscription that's happening. That's not inherent or naturally that way, right? In terms of other dialogues that I get into, so there are a lot. There's just one I want to talk about to speak to Marsha as well. So I also intervene in the violence against women conversation and reconceptualize what violence is, what it should look like. Is violence really just about specific individual transactions, or is this the violence of the state against these individuals? Last thing, then I'll stop. The Me Too movement, for example, the sex workers I worked with were not very happy about the depictions of violence that were prominent with the Me Too movement. They didn't think it spoke to or captured their own experiences of violence and where to locate violence in their lives.
Thank you. Very efficient. Fantastic. Thank you, Sharmila. Okay. Anna and Flavia, did you want to come in on social reproduction at all, or are you okay?
Sure. So for us in labor law, the problem is how to transpose the social reproduction to labor law. Because we already know that the work in social reproduction has value. No, not only economical value, but also value in other dimensions, like I was saying, care work. We have dimensions of time that not can be measured for economical criteria created by labor law, like the constant absence and presence of mothers who has to go to work and leave their kids, and they're thinking in their kids while they're working outside, and when they are at home they're thinking about their jobs and while they are caring of their kids. So these dimensions labor law still doesn't get it. So how can we transpose to law how we use how can we juridify this is the process of juridification. So we have some solutions, but all of them, they have failures, like domestic wages that everyone knows, no? But Rosa Maria Dalla Costa, Silvio Federici, Cristina Carrasco, Amaya Pérez Orozco, but the domestic wage doesn't context the category of work, of labor, because it's still a basic income. So we are not problematizing here the epistemic basis of labor law. We can thinking about how to give protect employment together with daycare, but still put this reproduction work in a gender basis. And it's even worse because in Brazil, which will involve a subdelegation of white women to Black women to take care of their children. So in intersectional oppression, this will be even worse. So we don't know. We are trying here, but
It'll be
know.
so interesting to follow the struggles over it. And
yeah,
that's
because
the thing to watch out for. I'm going to have to stop you here, Flavia.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay, because I want all the panelists to come in on that question of precarity and subalternity. So starting with Priya, to whom the question was addressed, and then moving to Niharika, Sharmila, and then back to you, Flavia and Anna. Is that okay? Yeah. So remember, people, my lovely people, we have 3 minutes. I can possibly steal, Mary's here, so I'll probably look for her nod. I can steal another minute, but that's all I can do. Okay, so let's go for it. Yeah.
Thanks, Sumi. So much as you were saying, I think a lot of the dominant archive I look at was within the register of, what Ranjit Guha calls the stentorian voice of the state. And Clara, to your question, why I classify the subaltern archive as precarious is because in its physical form, it is, in fact, because a lot of this was sort of slogans raised at rallies, tattered pamphlets, and notes from, police stations that are stored in the basements of these existentially threatened NGOs, especially in Modi's India. But that said, I think that it is really, really important also for me to clarify that I don't have any illusion of the sort of perfect separability of the dominant and subaltern archive. And they're by no means hermetically sealed. And there is no sort of seamlessness of the hegemony of dominant power relations in the first, or the radical, inevitable alterity of the knowledge that is in the subaltern archive, right? So there is this huge risk of reifying and fetishizing the subaltern archive as a site of radical alterity. And my project in particular risks instituting a new binary of the dominant versus subaltern in place of the binary that I'm seeking to challenge. But I think that what I try to do in response to that is to offer the subaltern archive as a resource through which to glimpse alternative epistemic arrangements, which often appear alongside reiterations of dominant epistemes, and to acknowledge both of that. And I think, again, part of what I'm trying to do is, and I think a lot of panelists yesterday also mentioned Jennifer Nash's work of, letting go of defensive attachments. And so I also want to be careful not to have these defensive attachments to the alternative conceptual arrangements that I'm suggesting, and to recognize that sort of at best they are inadequate placeholders for very complex realities and experiences that can and should never be contained within abstract conceptual frames. And so Nash's corrective to this defensiveness is then to think about an ongoing dynamic relationship of care and intimacy and investment and accountability with the archives and subjects that researchers encounter. So I suppose that's where I'll end.
Okay, thank you.
Just to keep it really simple and quick. So I think in terms of my research, the idea of precarity, I think one also has to look at the scaffolding of precarity that is generated right around Kashmir, on which the idea of the Indian nation state in itself is relying. So, Athazia, who's a Kashmiri feminist anthropologist, would call this the gullibility of Kashmiri bodies, wherein their racialization, both as Kashmiri Muslims, but also as Kashmiris, who are then seen as sort of suspects in the nation state imaginary, right? Render them precarious across multiple sort of domains. And I think the possibility of a conceptual reorientation will have to be attentive to the sort of multivalent material, discursive, narrative, embodied ways in which precarity in itself plays out, both in terms of lived realities, but also what then translates into knowledge making.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Yes, please, Sharmila.
Just very quickly, I mean, in the context of my specific project, right, sex work is such a diverse field. It's even insane that I'm speaking about it as though it's monolithic, because it's not. And that alone is already really unstable, right? And very diverse. So there's a lot of recognition of that. There's a lot of, like, you know, intellectually humble claims and not overstating claims. Like Priya's experience super resonates with me as well, so I just won't repeat that. I did have a slightly easy way out in terms of negotiating this, which was in the recommendation section of my chapter. I was very, very clear that we need to increase the political agency of this community, because they are probably better able to represent this complexity. I can do I can start the conversation, but so there, that was one way of reconciling it for me.
Yeah, thank you. Anna and Flavia.
Okay,
yeah.
I'll just point out some aspects of my research that connects with the questions. You know, talking about the waste speakers specifically, even though through the ILO, men are the majority in formal work, women have the jobs with the worst conditions. But in the way speaking, usually the ones that work on the street by themselves, the majority are men, but women are in association and cooperatives where they have better working conditions and where they can create a space, not free, obviously, but where they have more autonomy, where this sexist rationality doesn't run because it's a cooperative, right? So it's a very interesting type of work to study and analyze. And the fact that they are informal and the workers are very poor doesn't mean that they are not organizing. They are, like the domestic workers, and every day they are negotiating with multiple actors. The domestic worker with the family, with the white woman that is the employer, the waste speakers with the city police, with the dealer who buys their residues, with other cooperatives. So they are not like waiting for labor law to come. They are organizing, they have norms, and labor law has to learn what they are doing and then try to dialogue with this reality.
Great, thank you very much. Flavia, are you okay? Do you want to say something? Last word or?
I'll be quickly. I totally agree with Anna. We have to strip away the messianism the labor law imposed to us academics. I think starts by changing our language, our concepts, but also the way we're speaking with each other, the way we dress, our conducts. And I think this is strategic essentialism in labor law, but I don't know what is the limit of this. I ask myself every day.
But I think, thank you very much. I think we've done quite a lot of work here today. We've struck major blows at a lot of methodological gods. We struck a blow at methodological positivism, methodological nationalism, methodological individualism, and I could go on, but we've run out of time. The workshop, of course, is envisioned as a long-term conversation. So even though our time here is up, we're going to keep continuing to talk about things, about conceptual possibilities, intellectual resources, but also I think a strong ethical, political commitment to projects. And I think that is something that needs much more, we simply need to put that also fairly center stage and foreground, that commitment, that political commitment to political projects towards political change. So thank you very much. And I'll see you at the round table in the afternoon. Thank you very much.